Okay, friends, we are ready to hear from a judge. Anne, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to this fascinating program. I have to confess to a great deal of intimidation at the so many brilliant academic minds gathered before me. And unfortunately, I have to start off with a confession and an apology. In the brochure you have, I start by saying, according to Socrates, there are 4 aspects of being a fine judge: to hear courteously, to answer wisely, to consider soberly, and to decide impartially. So I came across that quote as I was reading materials in preparation for today, and it was quoted by a lot of articles, many of them written by judges about the art of judging. And so I thought it was apt, and I put it in. I then got an email from one of your number asking me where I'd found that reference. He advised that it didn't sound like Socrates. Who knew? I don't know what Socrates sounds like. He then said that he had Googled it, and he found it in hundreds of places on the internet attributed to Socrates. I went, phew. No. He then added the clincher, and I quote, "A search through the entire Platonic corpus didn't turn up anything." Busted. So I decided to come clean. I fessed up. I found it in an article, and I did not check my source. My bad. I apologize. But I've learned a lesson here. I'm not going to try to compete with you people in your academic game. I do know some things you don't. They're practical things. They're not academic things. And I'm going to speak more about my experience. I've been a trial judge in Toronto, in the highest trial court in Ontario, for 24 years. I know where we've come from in terms of how judges express how they feel about things, about the connection between thinking and feeling. I know where we come from. I know we're changing somewhat, and I know we're not there yet. So I'm going to skip the philosophy, and I'm going to talk to you about what I do know. So here's where we come from. Lady Justice, portrayed as blind. The process of judging being pure intellect and logic. Judges had to be above the fray, not part of the common people. And rendering justice was thought to be pure logic and intellect. As we came into the 1800s, the ideal of this all-wise, impartial judge, blind to his own emotions, became what we expected of judges. And even when I was appointed in 1995, those vestiges were still there. Shortly after I was appointed, one of the more senior female judges came to my office and just dropped by to chat and give me some friendly advice. And truly it was friendly. She in fact became a very good friend. What she told me was it was important to maintain the comportment of a judge everywhere. For example, she said, she would not consider going to Loblaws to purchase groceries unless she was wearing a tailored suit and full makeup. So I was a divorced mother of 3 little children, 11, 9, and 5. That wasn't going to happen. I also, in my first year, took what we refer to as baby judge training. So in your first year, you have all of these training courses. And an elderly chief justice from another province spoke and advised that judges should never, ever, under any circumstances, be seen to be drinking alcohol in public. And he included in that having a glass of wine with dinner. Well, I was a divorced mother with 3 little children. If I got to eat somewhere other than McDonald's and it had wine, I was drinking it. So we are changing. We have to be part of the real world. And those concepts have been with us for centuries. Very often, we use standards that relate to what would a reasonable person, what would an ordinary person do. So, for example, self-defense in a criminal trial. What is a reasonable amount of force? Reasonable expectations of the parties in a contract. Whether the actions of a defendant fall below the standard of care in a negligence case. These are all concepts of regular people, what would a reasonable person do? And more, we as judges are recognizing that we aren't interchangeable, unfeeling cogs, and what our own personal backgrounds and experiences have been contributes to our understanding of the reasonable person. In England, where we get our law from, basically, the concept of the reasonable person evolved into this notion of the man on the Clapham omnibus. And that became part of the analysis of negligence law. So I had a law clerk working with me to do some research. She has a background in philosophy. She had nothing to do with the Socrates fiasco. I brought her in when I realized I need help. So the expression was first used in 1871 by Lord Bowen. And he later became a judge, but he first used it as a barrister arguing a case. And it was later picked up by Lord Collins in 1903 in a judgment, and then it continued on from there. So I had my student look at who was Bowen and who was Collins. So Bowen came from a religious family. His father was a minister. His mother was Austrian nobility. He attended private schools his entire life. In a memoriam piece about him, his writer, the author of the report, said that he had a, quote, tendency to rhetoric, and also noted that he was well known for the fact that his jury instructions were, quote, too subtle of thought and language and refined irony to be understood by members of the jury. Lord Collins had also a religious upbringing in private schools, studying the classics. Another memoriam piece about him said the following: his hours of recreation were given to fishing, the sport of the contemplative man, to golf, the brain worker's athletics, to cycling and shooting, as well as to companionship with the masterpieces of literature. So we are recognizing concepts of a reasonable person, a regular person. But my question is, at this point in time, do Lord Bowen and Lord Collins know who that is? So here's Lord Bowen and Lord Collins, and here's the man on the Clapham omnibus. I don't think they ever took that bus. But then along came Lord Denning, and if you'll indulge me just for a moment, I just love Lord Denning. I've loved Lord Denning since I was a law student. He's no longer with us. He died in 1999 at the age of almost 100. Lord Denning was a different kind of judge. He was described as a man of the people. He introduced notions of real emotion and empathy into his judgments. I'll give you one example. This is my favorite Lord Denning case. This is about Mr. Jarvis. Mr. Jarvis was going on vacation for 2 weeks to Switzerland, and he saw this brochure that said it was going to be a house party kind of place, and it had its own bar. There's a welcome party on arrival, afternoon tea, cake, and a yodeler by candlelight. was like, it was supposed to be fantastic. He signed up for 2 weeks. Needless to say, when he got there, it didn't quite live up to expectations. He paid £64 for this trip. He sued because he didn't get what he bargained for. At trial, the trial judge said, "You're right, you didn't get what you bargained for," and he gave him back half his money. He gave him back £32. And then he appealed, and Lord Denning's judgment in Jarvis and Swan Tours is now just a gem, because for the first time, it changed the law on how we measure damages in cases like this and gave him compensation for his disappointment. But here's Lord Denning's style. Small, sorry. He talked about there were only 13 people on the first week, and the next week, only Mr. Jarvis. That was it. It wasn't a house party. The skiing was terrible. The skis they gave him were only 3 feet long. And then Lord Denning continues. There were many other matters too. They appear trivial when they are set down in writing, but I have no doubt they loomed large in Mr. Jarvis's mind when coupled with the other disappointments. He did not have the nice Swiss cakes he was hoping for. The only cakes for tea were potato crisps and little dry nut cakes. The yodeler evening consisted of one man from the locality who came in his working clothes for a little bit and sang 4 or 5 songs very quickly. So there's an example of Lord Denning recognizing really what this experience was for poor Mr. Jarvis. And he took that into account. He said, he saved up. He had only 2 weeks holidays. He spent the whole year looking forward to it, and then it was terrible. Giving him back half doesn't even get close. Giving him back all his money doesn't compensate him for his disappointment. So he gave him £125, changing the law. So my thesis is empathy is what made that difference. Lord Denning didn't go to private schools. He went to a school sponsored by the National Society for the Education of the Poor. He was just really smart. So he won scholarships all over the place. He taught himself mathematics because it was an entry exam for Oxford. Likewise, Greek. He started as a teacher, thought it was too boring, became a lawyer, and then became a judge. So, empathy. We're beginning to see it. And there's Lord Denning. He's looking more like the guy on the Clapham bus, isn't he? So, fast forward a bit. The more modern view of judges and feelings. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was some considerable research and analysis about the role of emotion in judging. Judicial institutions also began to recognize that judges had personal backgrounds and experiences that would inform their decision-making. We began to see more diversity in the appointments to the court, recognizing that it was important to have those points of view. This is from the Ethical Principles for Judges. It's a commentary on, it's not binding, it's just a commentary and advice for judges on how they should conduct themselves. But we're seeing here now official recognition within the judiciary. Legal standards frequently call for the application of the reasonable person test. Judicial fact-finding, an important part of a judge's work, calls for the evaluation of evidence in light of common sense and experience. Therefore, judges should, to the extent consistent with their special role, remain closely in touch with the public. That's the current iteration. It has been adopted in various iterations by the Supreme Court of Canada as a standard, now a legal standard that is recognized. Unfortunately, the way these cases tend to come up, where there's some kind of emotional thing about a judge, what the judge has done, is somebody now complains that the judge is biased, or not impartial. And so their decision is challenged on the basis that their emotion got in the way. And that's how it then winds its way up. So there was a case in Nova Scotia. There was a judge appointed in Nova Scotia in 1987. Her name was Corinne Sparks. And she was the first Black judge in Nova Scotia in 1987. She was the first female Black judge in Canada ever to be appointed. So she was sitting in youth court. And she had a case where this kid, he's 15, had interfered with a police officer who was arresting his best friend. And he, for his troubles, got himself charged with assaulting a police officer in the execution of his duty. And that case came before Justice Sparks. In the course of argument, the Crown asked a question, which, by the way, a Crown should never ask. Why would the police officer lie? And Justice Sparks shot back. He wouldn't be the first police officer to mislead the court. Police officers have been known in the past to mislead the court. And police officers have been known to overreact when dealing with visible minorities. That wasn't part of her analysis for why she dismissed the charges. That was separate, but she did make that comment. And the Crown appealed to the Court of Appeal of Nova Scotia. Court of Appeal of Nova Scotia said, very, very bad, set it aside, went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And even at the Supreme Court level, the court split 6-3. They all recognized experience and background made a difference. And they did adopt the commentaries, but the minority of the judges felt that this just went too far. That her personal experience of racism and understanding disadvantaged youth in rural Nova Scotia could not be part of her analysis and should not be ever mentioned. But the majority went with this. So this is in 1997. This is a more recent example, the Yukon Francophone case. And here, the court quoted from a textbook, scholarly work, Judge in a Democracy. The judge is a product of his times, living in and shaped by a given society in a given era. The purpose of objectivity is not to sever the judge from his environment or to rid a judge of his past, his education, his experience, his belief, or his values. Its purpose is to encourage the judge to make use of all of those personal characteristics to reflect the fundamental values of society. So we do have recognition there of at least that much of it, that you carry your experiences with you and they inform your judgment. Now, I'd like to say that it was judges who were at the forefront of this movement in the 1980s and 90s, but it was not. It was you people. It was the legal academics and psychologists, neuroscience, all of those disciplines. There was a very lively discourse proceeding through the 80s and 90s. At the beginning, there were some naysayers, but the recognition now is so consistently, overwhelmingly the same that I'm not even going to go into what all of it is. I'll just bring you to the tagline. Obviously, emotion cannot be separated from cognition because emotion is cognition, and we can't pretend we don't have it. So we start from the premise that emotion is part of the decision making. And then we go to, well, what now do we do? Because some emotions are obviously wrong. You cannot be making decisions based on personal bias or who your friends are, economic interests. You need to be impartial. And not all emotions are equal. So there's been some really interesting writing by Professor Laura Little on the whole issue of adjudication and emotion. And she looks at this in this one article that I've quoted here. She looks at it with 4 sets of emotions that she considers: empathy and sympathy, loyalty and gratitude, jealousy and envy, disgust and hate. Now, I'm not going to deal with loyalty and gratitude. Obviously, those cannot be part of judicial decision making. Likewise, jealousy and envy, I don't even know how they would ever come up, but certainly can't be a basis. But what's interesting about empathy and sympathy and disgust and hate is that in one aspect, they're there and it's important for them to be there, but you can't go too far along that spectrum. And in truth, these sets, empathy and sympathy, disgust and hate, they're not really that different one from the other. Empathy, I feel your pain. Sympathy, I'm sorry that you're in pain. Not that different. So empathy is generally considered to be a good thing for a judge to have, being able to appreciate the situation the other person is in, whether that is a victim of a crime or a person who's been injured in an accident, or people that are testifying, understanding how they feel to be there and testifying. That's empathy. That's Lord Denning. That's the good stuff. But how about sympathy? Does that go too far over the line? So this judge obviously went too far. She's not on our court. She's on American Idol. But what about this judge? This is recent. This is a judge in British Columbia. She took a guilty plea on a sexual interference with an 8-year-old case. And the mother gave a victim impact statement, which she read in court. And you could appreciate how gut-wrenching that is to listen to. And the judge dabbed a tear from her eye. Headlines all over the place. The crying judge. Immediately a motion to have her recused from the case for bias and lack of impartiality, which she dismissed and sentenced him to 14 months. But, yeah, I'll give you another example of an empathetic judge. This happened in Toronto. This particular judge, also a woman, was sitting on a sexual assault trial. She had been a youth court judge before she came to our court. And in that context, it's much more hands-on. Offenders come in repeatedly while they're on parole. You actually develop more of a relationship with them. And she had, with some young offenders, had started giving them a book and said, read chapter 2, and when you come back in a month, we'll talk about it. And she had done that. But now she's on our court, sexual offender trial. She tried this case where both the accused and the complainant were 19 years old. And it was awful. And she recognized that both lives were destroyed in some way, really. And after she sentenced the guy to a stiff sentence. Young offender, 19 years old, no prior record. She gave him 3 years. It was a brutal assault. But she recognized, she had empathy for both of them, whose lives had been so totally messed up. So what she did was, she purchased a book, one for each of them, and she gave it to them as a gift, in the hopes that they would find some help in there. And here's what happened. Here it is. This is the headline. What self-help book do you gift a rapist? Here's from the article. What kind of book would you give to a man who forced a woman to provide oral sex, assaulted her vaginally, and then FaceTimed his friends as she, naked, vomited in a toilet and cried? I know what you're thinking. Rapists are so hard to shop for. Really? turn to disgust and hate. On the one hand, some say that civilization depends on disgust. That, you know, what we are disgusted about as a people says who we are. And so it's an important emotion. And Professor Little really explores these two concepts very closely. But she also points to the fact that, you know, this is a short little hop from disgust to hate, which informs things like anti-Semitism and misogyny and homophobia, all kinds of hate crimes. So it's a difficult thing to deal with. And she doesn't really come down on one side or the other, but I'm going to. I'll offer my view. I'll tell you, if you're not disgusted at some of the things I have seen, at video footage of child pornography so vile I won't even tell you what's in it, then there's something wrong with you. You need to be disgusted by that. Our criminal code, this is the overarching fundamental principle in sentencing. A sentence must be proportionate to the gravity of the offense and the degree of responsibility of the offender. In our case law that we've developed in this area, we talk about moral blameworthiness of the accused. I would submit that disgust for the nature of the crime and the moral depravity of the offender are appropriate emotions to be having. Indeed, since the sentencing judge is required to assess moral blameworthiness of the accused, it is necessary for the judge to determine what is in fact moral. So, disgust is a bugbear for me because I got into a little bit of a kerfuffle with this in a case called Medford. It was a sexual assault trial. I found the accused guilty of sexual assault, quite brutal sexual assaults, and he videotaped portions of it so he could watch it later on his phone. And so, between where the accused is in the box, I'm here on the bench, and between me and the screen where I'm watching this, and on huge screens in the courtroom, is this gentleman's mother. And his defense was that he hired this woman who was a prostitute, and he paid her to pretend that she was being forced, and that this was all consensual. She was battered, bruised, got a knife to her throat. And I convicted him, and then a long time passed. Counsel had, just before sentencing, moved before me to have me remove myself because of an expression of disgust on my face while watching the video. So first of all, they said, you know, they had this particular lawyer who was there and saw this, said he'd seen judges look at child pornography with less disgust on their face than I had. So I said, no, I'm not recusing myself. But in my reasons, I said, I found it distasteful to rate kind of on a scale of what you can be disgusted by and what not. That made no sense to me. I said that I'm not much of an actress, nor am I known to be a person whose face is completely unreadable. However, the question is not my acting ability, nor my ability to hide my emotions effectively. The question is whether a judge should have such emotions at all. If a judge has a reaction of distaste for violent subject matter, is that judge incapable of judging a case fairly? The answer to that question must be a resounding no. Judges are human beings who will have the same range of emotions as other human beings, regardless of their role as impartial decision maker or the fact that they have seen many horrible images to which the general public is not routinely exposed. Indeed, I would suggest that if there are judges who do not feel such emotions or who have become indifferent to human suffering over time, those judges are less equipped to be fair and impartial than are their counterparts with common human emotions. So I'm running rapidly out of time. I wanted to talk quickly about judicial emotional regulation, which is how we recognize there's some bad emotions that we don't want to carry with us, and others which are important to use, and how we can control them. So this is Professor Maroney, and a very interesting article about this issue. So attentional deployment and distraction. Like, that's not a good idea, right? Just avoid the situation. I can't, it's my job. Suppression of the emotion just doesn't work. It's there. You can't pretend it's not there. But this is, though, what we have been doing all these many decades and centuries. Behavioral suppression, she says, is also a bad idea, as in, don't show anything on your face or react in any way, because she's saying, don't try to do that. It's just eating up the energy you need to be, judging and thinking. But there are times when you just have to. I mean, you can't, start crying in front of a jury or, look really upset about something when, the jury has to react. So you kind of have to do that. Disclosure, yeah, that's sort of talking about it. We don't really. Our colleagues are very supportive quite often, but it's just we don't really talk about it much. I've spoken at 2 judicial seminars about it, and it was thought to be shocking. Like, oh, we're talking about it now. So the best ways of dealing with it are situation selection and modification and cognitive reappraisal. I do both of these. Situation selection, obviously it's in the courtroom, but a lot of my work is not in the courtroom, it's writing. And when materials are really toxic, and they can be, I don't bring them home. I don't bring them home, I don't bring them to my vacation property where I do a lot of my work. They're in a closed box in my office, and when I work on them, my door is not open, my door is closed. Often I cry, but I do it behind closed doors, and I keep those in a separate place. So there's that kind of thing that you can compartmentalize somewhat and control, take breaks, that sort of thing. I also take breaks from sitting in child pornography and sexual assault over and over and over. I mean, I go to the trial court and say, don't we have any fraud? Really? And the other is cognitive reappraisal, addressing what your emotions are, trying to really bring other emotions to bear and see it from all different sides and look at the reverse of the emotion and try and scope it and work with it that way. So these areas I haven't even touched on, and I knew I wouldn't get to them. Post-traumatic shock syndrome, I mean, there's a lot of trauma involved in seeing these things. Victim impact statements, they emphasize often all the wrong emotions. I haven't mentioned anger, which is usually where judges get in trouble, but that's more of a guy thing. So here's where we started, justice, blind, and here's where I think we are. We're getting there. So I have a bibliography with a lot of information. If you're interested, I think people can make that available to you. Thank you so much.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. We have time for discussion.
Sure.
Could you talk, I have the mic, so here we go. Could you talk more about victim impact statements and how they have changed the court process?
It's a very, very difficult, explosive issue. In the United States, there's a lot of writing critical of using victim impact statements at sentencing because what they do is inflame the emotions. And In the United States, they're not mandatory. Ours are mandatory. So they get filed. And so there's nothing I can say about we shouldn't be looking at them. However, they're just gut-wrenching. And they cast the whole sentencing analysis in the wrong way. Once the trial is over and guilt has been found, the focus has to be on how do we now deal with this offender. And I'm sorry, the nature of the criminal trial process is not to make the victim feel better. It isn't. There are other services for that, and we're not it. And I appreciate that people want the experience to vent, and they have it. But it is extremely disconcerting, diverting to hear these tragic, awful, heartrending stories from victims. I did a very difficult case a number of years ago. It was a murder of a young woman, and her parents came every single day of the trial, and it was just, she was stabbed multiple times. It was horrible. And when I wrote my I was concerned they would not understand that I got that. In my decision, I addressed why we don't allow parents to impose the sentence on someone who's hurt their child. If somebody hurt my child, nothing I wouldn't do to them. But you know, that's not an appropriate emotion, revenge. So, person lost her life. She was wonderful. However, I addressed the loss of that life the same as I would address the loss of a life of a homeless person. He doesn't get a worse sentence because she was so fantastic. So I said that to the parents in my reasons. It wasn't easy.
Thank you, Anne. I think we're over there.
Yeah, Daphne actually took my question, but I'll ask another that was more background. Just in terms of the trajectory of becoming a judge, can you explain, I know there are different courts, drug courts, family courts, and what are the burnout rates, and do they vary amongst courts?
There's a very, very high job satisfaction rate amongst judges. We are required to retire at 75. We're able to basically retire at 65. Between then and 10 years from retirement, you can do what's called supernumerary status, where you work full-time and work half-time and get paid full-time. And we have a huge number of supernumerary judges who work full-time anyway. I would do this job. I just love this job. It's so interesting. It's so interesting. Everything about it is interesting. Sometimes very difficult, but it's really interesting. Appointments at our court is the highest trial court, appointed by the federal government. You have to have been a lawyer for, I think it's 20 years, and then you make your application, and there's a committee that approves it, and then it goes to cabinet. And the same process for the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada. Below that, the judges are all appointed by the provincial government. I don't actually know what the requirements are there, but I know they have a similar vetting process.
Your Honor,
Yes.
I am retired now, but at a time in the past, I spent 10 years working in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice as a court service officer, eventually rising to being a judge's deputy. And I have to say, I have never met a more wonderful group of people than your judges. I never had the privilege of working in your court, but I worked in many courts with many judges, and in the end, I just felt like crying because I had to retire in order to go to my real profession, which is as a novelist. But to this day, and that was about 10 years ago, I just miss them. I never met a finer group of people. And for that reason, I am not in the least surprised at the excellence of your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Use the mic and stand up, please.
Can you comment, please, on the reasonable man or woman and judicial enforcement of contracts of adhesion?
No. I really can't talk about issues of law that would come before me.
But it's not applied.
No, I'm not comfortable talking about it. I also haven't sat in civil in 15 years. I'm almost exclusively criminal law now.
It occurred to me when you were talking about the evolution of, through Judge Denning and others, how the judicial system has evolved to accept, to some extent, emotion. I wonder if you could comment on the Gladue sentencing as perhaps part of that.
Yeah, it is part of that. The Gladue case from the Supreme Court of Canada requires special consideration in sentencing when you have Aboriginal offenders. So a very detailed report is prepared by a group. There's a special group that does the Gladue reports. They go way back into the history of the person, and so you get way more information about the person. Indigenous groups are grossly overrepresented in our prison population, and it's a social evil that we're attempting to address, and the Gladue reports are meant to do that and to try and find ways of channeling the sentencing into the non-sort of custodial, traditional places we usually use. So it's a very valuable tool. There's recently been some consideration at sort of tentative early levels about whether we should be having Gladue courts for other minority groups as well, but I don't know where that would go.
I have a question. We are legalizing drugs now,
Yeah.
sort of. What happens to all the people who have been found guilty in our prisons for crimes that are no longer going to be crimes?
Well, they were crimes when they committed them. So from our perspective as judges, that has nothing to do with us. I think the government is looking at pardons, but that, again, has nothing to do with us. And we're still getting marijuana trafficking cases. I have them all the time. Police are often not prosecuting unless it's with something else. So if somebody has cocaine and fentanyl and marijuana and a gun, they'll get charged with all of it. But if they just have marijuana on the street, they're probably not going to get charged. If they have a gun, they will. If they're trafficking in many, many thousands, like hundreds of thousands of dollars level or massive production, that's still illegal. And they're still prosecuted.
Yes, yes, ma'am. I was hoping that just to clarify the importance of the difference between judging and sentencing. And here's, because I think impartiality remains really important in, is this person that you're, on whose guilt you're proceeding, somebody who really is guilty of what they're charged with? Mm-hmm. If the person is someone who's engaged in various disgusting or abusive behavior, then a lot of the biases are appropriate at the sentencing stage. But again, I'm wondering, we've only emphasized that aspect, and I would assume the most challenging thing might be the sort of thing that I was told by a defense lawyer, a woman in Montreal who was defending priests accused of child abuse. And she was interrogating the victim of abuse, and she said it was very clear that this woman was so badly abused over the years that she really couldn't identify the accused as the person who was responsible for that.
And that's very common. And I did a sexual assault trial that got a lot of attention a couple of summers ago. 3 police officers that were charged with sexually assaulting a parking enforcement officer. Everybody was drunk. That's often the case. And you know, there'd been a lot of backlash to judges acquitting people on sexual assault charges. But it had just been after Ghomeshi, and it had just been after the judge in Nova Scotia that said drunks can consent, which was an unfortunate choice of words, but the truth is drunks can consent. And it's just the question of how drunk is the person. If they're incapable of giving or withholding consent, then it's rape no matter what. But when somebody is that impaired, their memory is usually pretty faulty. It's patchy, it's in and out. They have impressions of things that are wrong. Their memory is in holes, bits and pieces. They are positive something happened. They're positive something happened this way, and then there's video, and not true at all. And so it becomes extraordinarily difficult. As much as you see this woman in the box weeping and feel for her, being satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that her version of it is true and his version, you haven't even got a doubt now, is extraordinarily difficult. I acquitted them. Most of their conduct for the entire evening was despicable. Despicable. But I had a reasonable doubt about what happened in that hotel room. So I acquitted. Yeah. Oh, you didn't have a mic, sorry. Someone's coming. Are we okay for time?
Yes.
Okay.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay.
It can be also a general discussion, but you can just go on.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you for your inspiring topics. As human beings, we are full of emotions. But however, your title, Judging Without Emotion, seems to be a theoretical domain, yes,
Yeah.
other than real life domain. So what's your comments on that?
It's impossible. I mean, your emotions are there. What you need to do, and we've got to stop saying, "Oh no, I am completely logical about this entire process." I think you have to confront the fact that you have those emotions. You have to think about, how is this affecting me? Am I bringing the right emotions into play here? And that is a cognitive process that we must exercise and we can train ourselves to do. And we should be teaching judges that right from the beginning. But we aren't. But I think we will be soon.
Thank you for a good talk. I wanted to go back to the idea of the man on the Clapham bus, because I was fascinated by that. And I wondered if that was where the idea of jury, having juries rather than simple judges making the final decisions. Could you comment?
It was.
Yeah.
It was to have ordinary people making the decisions in a case.
And what do you think about that? Do you think they do a better job than you do?
No. I'm often very happy to have a jury there, so I don't have to, because they don't give reasons. They just give a judgment, right? They say guilty or not guilty, and they don't have to sign their names to it and justify it in writing, which I do. And there are those kinds of cases where I'm going, well, please pick a jury, please, 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 a jury. And the police officer case, I'll confess, was one of them, because it was slated to be heard by a jury. And then they re-elected, so I had to do it. But it would have been, much easier for a jury, 12 people all agree, guilty or not guilty. I can live with that, right? They don't have to give their reasons. So there's a great utility in it. I think from the perspective of the accused who gets the choice, they sometimes don't, they're from a background or have life experiences where they don't trust the people sitting in my seat. They don't think I can be fair. And they want to take their odds with 12 people just pulled from anywhere, right? Just randomly selected. And that, I respect that right. I can see that's where it came from, judges being too removed and not in touch with what was going on in the real world. And I think from the perspective of an accused, that's still there. So that's what it is. From do they do a better job? I think they come to practical solutions sometimes, common sense type things. But there are lots of jury verdicts where I just scratch my head and go, I have no idea how they got to that.
Are you in a position to comment on the Ghomeshi case, or if not, at least what kind of an impact it has had since in terms of sexual assault decisions? Was it a turning point? Or,
no, not at all.
No?
It was an ordinary case. And the critics of the Ghomeshi decision, I venture to bet, have not read the decision in the Ghomeshi case. I had this argument with my own sister, who said, blah, 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 blah. And I said, did you read the decision? I don't need to. Oh, yes, you do. This is a very careful analysis of the inconsistencies in evidence. She says X, that was a lie. She says B, they cooked that one up between them. There were lots and lots of inconsistencies like that. And the question is, are you now satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that this is a criminal that you're going to send to jail for several years? So I read that decision. It was very carefully and thoughtfully written. Didn't change the law on sexual assault. It applied the law on sexual assault, and it did it very well.
I think this is the last question. Thank you for a wonderful talk. You've given us lots to think about. We're all familiar that photoshopping can alter those sort of images, but if you're following AI, this can be done to videos and so on. Mm-hmm. Do you see that a point where that sort of evidence will become inadmissible, won't be used in courts?
What kind of evidence?
Any sort of
video evidence?
Video, photos.
No. We get manufactured evidence lots of times. But it's capable of being detected. Oh yeah, they do expert analysis on it to see if there's all these wizards out there. I wouldn't begin to know, but there are about things that have been altered and not altered. But when we do get video, we have to verify it. You have to be able to place it in time and where did this come from? You can't just pull it off the internet. So for example, I did I did a trial involving the riots after the G20. And the police just sat there and people sent them video. There were two kinds of people out there, people rioting and people taking pictures of the people rioting. And so there was tons and tons of footage, but the police didn't just pull out stuff from the internet and put it. They had to find the people who posted it, the people who filmed it, identify the people in it. Of course, some of the people in it were themselves taking selfies of themselves in front of a police car they just set fire to. Clever. Cell phones, oh, manna from heaven. People can't stay off them. They're just amazing. I had a sexual assault trial where the guy, he raped this woman that he'd been dating, and they'd broken up, and he talked his way into going back over, and she didn't want to have sex, and he raped her anyway. And then he left, and then the next night he texted her again and said, "Can I come over?" And she said, "What are you talking about? You raped me." And he said, "Yeah, I know, but I'm sorry." Exhibit 1.
And on this note, thank you so much for this wonderful talk.